panel. So in the spirit of Bandung, and we're going to do this is the first edition of a yearly conference that we want to organize. So we want to do it in the spirit of Bandung. That means bringing about the different struggles together and exchanging knowledge and how we can support each other. So that's why in that tradition we're also going to have from specific different regions a panel. So I want to ask for the panelists, specifically Kjeld Kroon. So you can applaud for Kjeld Kroon. He comes from Lincoln in Bonaire and studies in Leiden. He's an activist for Bonaire's political rights and did an internship at Human Rights in Bonaire in 2021. As a philosophy student, global and comparative perspectives, he specializes in decolonial and political philosophy, and I know he tries to be we said it today when we were rooting, to be honest about what's going on, and I know Kjeld is someone who's really honest about what's going on in Bonaire, so we're going to hear more about that. Thank you for being here, Kjeld, with us today. And next to that we have Fitria Jelita, who's going to speak from an Indonesian perspective. She's a journalist, writer, and writes about topics that are close to our hearts, such as Islam, Muslims, and the history of the Netherlands in Indonesia. She is currently working on her first book about Indonesian perspectives on the colonial past/present, I might say. So thank you, Fitria, for being with us. And then last but not least, we have Pablo Alanes, and I met you on the phone, and today first time in person, and I really liked you, because he immediately offered, let me film this needs to be registered, so that's why he also brought the gear that we can watch it back later, and I really love that spirit, so I'm curious to hear from you as well. Pablo Alanes was part of the struggle in Bolivia. They have the first elected indigenous president there that was brought into power out of social movements, and he was part of these social movements at the time surrounding the 2000s, and that also had a social, cultural, political impact on the country, so we're going to learn or hear from you as well what that brought. So thank you for being here. So this is a question. Yes, I'll move this. Very good. To have a cameraman in the panel, so we have it. We're not looking to the table. So, a question to all three of you. The main theme of the conference is reparations and also decolonization, decolonial reparations. So that means also reparations from the position of the global South and other countries that are still being colonized, or where colonialism is, it's not a historic thing we commemorate, it's ongoing. From that perspective of line of thought, could you maybe share, and feel free, who wants to go first, share what is the colonial damage or ongoing colonialism that you still see from the context that you are from?
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, my name is Pablo Alanes. I come from Bolivia, and I'm very honored to be part of this conference. I guess it's very important that at these times, in what everything is going on in the world, in the history that we are building together, that we can realize that the colonialism is not only a thing of the past that damaged our past, but it's mostly our way that we understand life now, because it is inside of our actions, in everyday action. So if we believe that only being in this planet is just a matter of thinking, then we are being colonized. So we need to open our hearts, open our minds, and open our vision for different cultures and also ancient wisdom, which can allow us to be in balance and also to find possible answers and teachings that we can use to these times to finally prevail and go out from this crazy darkness that we are living.
Thank you. And maybe before you give it to the next one also, because you were active in the, you already said we cannot see it as a past, the colonialism. So in the 2000 people took to the street. Can you provide us with some context? Why did you join the social protest and what were the demands and what came out of it for you from that period?
Oh yes, back then in Bolivia, I guess that our history is very complex and it's like an extreme way of actions and social problems that have happened that it was very hard to see in the streets of the city and also in the country people that who is living actually in the time of I don't know, Jesus Christ maybe, you know, in that time, in the way that they feel, they understand life, in the way that they make their own food, in the way that they dress, in the way that they carry their own children, in the way they understand their closest loved ones, their family. So it's like an imagination of life that it comes from really a different time that is actually present. And this type of people amongst another type of people, like it's like completely progressists, like believing in hard work and creating institutions.
Linear thinking.
Yes, and this, and people who is more going to open the systems, and the people who believes in politics so much that they don't care too much about the soul and the heart, and mainly people who are hurting themselves without seeing them each other. So that was one of the reasons that I was really trying to be there and do something, because I truly, deeply believe that art and ancient culture and ancient wisdom is the only way that we have, the only tools that we have to do something about it, and then get together all the people.
Oh, that's beautiful, and thank you for sharing as well. And for those with context, what you were saying, people living in the times of Jesus Christ, or at least something that was pre-colonial, that was before Columbus arrived on the ship, that's still kept there, is very special as well, because in Bolivia, so Senduhira mentioned, right, the settler context of Australia, the United States, New Zealand, and so forth, but actually a lot of the countries also in the south of the US are also settler states. So you'll see that in the sense that you have Spanish and you call it Latin, and that's different. That's a different culture that they brought and imposed. And Bolivia is one of the last countries that have a majority indigenous still, because there has been such a huge colonial impact. And when you see these two worlds, let's say, meeting or living, I don't know, meeting is maybe not the right word, but living past each other, how did it make a difference that, let's say, from the movement that still maintains this other world, brought forward a president that now has to run a nation state? How did that make a difference according to you, and maybe what was still challenging? Because I can also imagine if you then have to operate another system that isn't from there, it can be challenging too. So if you could reflect on that.
Yes, I think it's very important to understand the situation that is the meaning of Bolivia, actually, because we are so blessed to have so many people, so many nations under our own territory, if you like to say.
Estimation, how many nations do you have?
How many nations do we have? 36 nations.
Yeah.
Altogether, I have a fellow Bolivian here. So we are here. Thank you. And 36 nations, and which some of them are really small. They're even like kind of tribes, but it's still living in without contact, which is the greatest thing ever. But some of them also are really big, and they are getting into the globalization and huge changes. So what I'm trying to say, that in a territory that has so many nations, we cannot make them standardize everyone into one type of citizen. It's impossible.
And that happens in the whole world. We cannot be standardized. We cannot be. I do deeply believe that the most important thing that we have here is that we are different. I like that I'm different from you. That makes us stronger.
Like richer.
Makes us stronger, because I can learn from you, you learn from me. So what happens in our country is that trying to go into a world of economic, political thinking, being in this ground of many nations, is absolutely a massive drama. So in the past we have a huge suffering by racism, because the people who have money, they were only people who damaged society, and not these nations that we know now, not even was taken care of. So our first fight was to eliminate war in the Middle East, try to change the racism that we have there. And that was possible. It was done by the movement of such a great movement of people and nations and different cultures that were fighting against after so many years. It's so difficult to explain, so much aspects in time that we've been through. But mainly is that. And and now we've seen that our biggest problem, in my view, in my eyes, is that corruption is one of the biggest problems that we have, as in any system. Everything is based in the money, and that creates corruption, and that creates a way of using people that is not doesn't fit. In Bolivia we have different cosmovisions, not just one. So what happens in Europe or in the rest of the world? To be in really contact, we need to step back a little bit and then open ourselves in our minds and everything to understand that there are different cosmovisions than us. The ones that are not based in individualism, in the people and in the self-empowerment and also in the competition. That's a huge mistake. And then there's another cosmovisions that are more into community, more into understanding us as a group, us meaning the plants, the soil, the water, the air, the mountains, all of it is our communities, our way of living. So there are different ways of live, So I think I'm getting lost.
No, but it's beautiful. You are sharing and answering the question, and one final question, and then I'll go to the other speakers. So I think you've clearly explained all that and the challenges with the different nations. 36 I mentioned, was it? And there was also a new flag made, the Wipala flag, right, to represent this. So you have, let's say, a symbolical representation or recognition that there's multiple nations living together under that one flag. What kind of, let's say, concrete material things, also to inspire of thinking of ways forward, did the new presidency bring to giving back to these nations or facilitating more the different cosmologies? Was there a certain impact that you're proud of that the movement gave after you took office?
The biggest achievement is that it brings the balance into society, so we can be more open and accept first how racist we were. And then that change, it makes a little bit of balance. And that was the most, the biggest step, I believe. After that, what we are having now is a misuse of the economy flow, so it is completely a mess. Personally, I don't believe that it's a good thing that the way the politics are going, because colonization brings this mindset of capitalism, and back there in Bolivia, everything went like hyper-capitalism. So everything is about huge corporations, and everybody wants to sell. We made the law for Mother Earth, but what happens there? They try to, with this law, use it protected areas to give it to maybe the Chinese people or some other great big companies to sell lithium and thing, So everything is tricky, very tricky with politics.
But thank you. I mean that also shows even if you get there, then even the work starts, because what you say, now you're there, so it opened up the space for the conversation to happen, but then it's still a process. So thank you for sharing, and I think that's also part of reparation. There's not an now we have repaired, right? It's going to be an intergenerational process. So I want to go, I mean, you're all very politely and in solidarity with each other, so you want to listen to each other. I don't know if we just follow like this, or is someone eager to answer the question that I... Do you remember the first question?
No, what's the first question?
Okay, so the first question, and then we went off, is what would the reparations mean in your context, but also how is colonialism and neocolonialism still visible in the context where you're
I think I'll have to start with the second part of the question first. How is colonialism and neocolonialism still visible? What I always say, and I bar no holds on saying this, is I come from Bonaire. It's one of the islands still under the control of the Dutch state, and it's by all means and purposes a colony. In the media, in academia, different terms are being used. Special municipality, overseas territories and stuff. But if you look at the construction of how things are in law and in rule, we're still in direct control from some ministers in The Hague, sometimes who've never even seen the island or been there, or you know. So I think.
Yeah, the wording in law is called public entity,
yeah,
right?
Public entity.
That's how it's on paper in the Constitution.
Yeah, public entity. So.
Like a park.
Something like that, yes. Something for the public to use, and then the question is, of course, which public. Yeah, the first part of your question is?
Well, but maybe to go for the colonial damage, so it's clear you don't have, let's say, sovereignty of your place, you're a public entity of the Netherlands. Can you maybe tell the implications of this, that you, what does it mean for the people?
Yeah, what this implies is that, of course, so we do have an island council. You can compare it to like a municipal council, but that council's task is only executive. So that council only gets to execute what is decided in The Hague. And that's problematic because, again, in The Hague, the people who are sitting there are not people from the islands. They don't have a feel for what's happening or what the people need or anything like that. And that causes a lot of tension. A lot. Tension maybe isn't the right word, but yeah, it's not great. With it comes also the discrepancy between people who are from the islands and people who are from the European part of the Netherlands, who, when on the island, have the same ability to do things in the sense of they can, when it comes by law, there's nothing that restricts one to do something that the other can't, which is fine. But the difference is that someone from here can come with so much more capital that those people just cannot get access to, and they buy up houses, grounds, businesses which when they run, by the way, they also do not hire locals explicitly. So it's creating, honestly, a big separation, a segregation even to an extent on the island from those who clearly are all from the European part of the Netherlands and those who have not, who are all from the Caribbean part, from Bonaire specifically in this case.
So it's almost like legalized settlers in that sense, right?
Yeah,
because you don't get a say to do it differently because you're under jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So, and they settle on the island. And can you also say something, because then there's a thing. So let's go back to the frame of the media. They say special municipality, right? So then you're part of the Netherlands. Is there equal citizenship? Are you equal to a Dutch person when it comes to social and economic situations?
When I'm here, yes. When I'm here, yes. When I'm there, no. So that's how I would say it. Coming, like, for example, in court cases we've had where people have been treated significantly different while having committed the same crime, and I don't think I have to explain very difficultly which of the people got the heavier sentence. So yeah, stuff like that you have that on which we don't have an equal basis. I kind of want to take a step back because generally in the world, with a lot of countries, there's been a move towards decolonizing, but somehow the Dutch state is the only one that's moving towards recolonizing. I find that a very interesting phenomenon to notice. And yeah, sorry, can you repeat your question again? I kind of
Well,
lost
so,
my
no,
train of
so it's part of it, so the settlement, and the question was also the impact, like what does it
Oh,
mean
yeah.
to live under the Dutch state,
the
and are you
yeah,
equal?
I remember,
Because they're
yeah,
both
I remember,
territories of the
I
Netherlands.
remember where I was going with this. Sorry. So the thing that is complicated about this recolonization move is that partially the people voted for it, but it was voted for under this trend of like, so either you're with us or you're without us. Without us meaning you're also gonna most likely get financial punishment for not being with the Dutch state. And people really were afraid of that, understandably so. So a lot of people wanted to vote safely to say, hey, and this also connects to the whole knowledge thing of, there's also just a lack of knowledge about politics, about everything actually, decolonization. So of course, if you're also surviving, the first thing you think is like, what is the safest choice I'm gonna make to live for the next day, you know? So that's kind of part of it. But the promise of when people voted to say, okay, let's strengthen these ties, was a basis of true political, economical, social equality. That was the promise that was made. And that's the promise why people picked that, because they figured, oh, if we get the same, sociale vangnet and stuff, I don't know how to say it.
Social benefits?
Social benefits, you get it's the same access to education, same access to economic opportunities and stuff like that. Sure, that would be beneficial. So that's what the people thought they were gonna get. But till this day, it's now 13 years later, we're still fighting for it. We're still fighting for it. There's a court case right now from Inkelboom, which is a laborers coalition and like union on the island, who's now suing the Dutch state exactly for not having even equal minimum wages to here. The minimum wage there is around $8. So that's €6 or something. You can already imagine that that's not really enough to live by. With that we have that prices, because of people with a lot of buying potential coming in, the prices for everything is going up, so the locals are being pushed out of, just being able
Poverty,
to, into poverty, yeah, out of even buying groceries and stuff, which is just becoming almost impossible for some people. So that's happening there as well. Yeah, so it's not equal, and we're still fighting for that. And I also want to jump in on the basis of why, for example, they didn't want to raise the minimum wage from the beginning and why it's taken so long, which in itself is a colonial and racist reason, because the reasoning that the state gave us, wait, if we raise the minimum wage on the island, it's going to attract too many people from the surrounding places, and we don't want that. Which is, first of all, racist and problematic, and then it's also kind of disingenuous, because it's the state who decides who can enter or not. So it's super disingenuous as well, but yet it's something that's cited as a reason. When it comes to inequality to labor, first of all, the islands don't have very big economies, so a lot of the money and everything usually would come through tourism. So restaurants, bars, hotels, tourism. I'm not going to go into whether we should do tourism debate or not, because I have my own issues with that as well. But fair, that's what people made their money with, how they made their living and everything. And with that difference in capital that's happening now, with a lot of wealthy people going to the islands, they're buying up all those restaurants, they're buying up all the hotels, they're buying up all the places where locals used to get their bread from. And they now explicitly, it's been in the newspapers and everything, explicitly say, we're not going to hire the locals because they are lazy.
Yeah. So colonialism is still with us. I can't add anything to that. I think you've pretty much answered how colonialism is working in Bonaire still. And I remember the first time reading also the One World article about the situation on the island, that you have different minimum wage, different pensions, different and you're still on Dutch territory. It baffled me that we still have these racial lines. So thank you for sharing that. And we're gonna have the second part for all three also about reparations and maybe also with the audience, but I want to go to Fitria, who is actually, also from Indonesia, will speak from that perspective, which I think is really important as well, with the Bandung Conference, which was an initiative that started there as well. So maybe you could answer the same question. Do you remember the question?
a bit.
How does colonialism still work through in the present in Indonesia? How do you see that ramification and
Right.
damage today?
Okay, first of all, thank you for having me here. Yeah, so I have been to Indonesia recently, and I have been brought up with the colonial history as how people in Indonesia see it. And it definitely differs from what we are taught here in the Netherlands. That's one thing. But what you see in Indonesia is that colonialism definitely still exists in the way people connect with each other. So it's a very social structure as well, that there is a form of classism and glorification of the West, basically. People are still idolizing it, the white man's ideal. And when I'm there, I'm very aware of my position because I live here, I am privileged. So it's very hard for me to tell them, but it's not like that. And yeah, that's something that really runs through how Indonesia runs on a day-to-day basis. But also when you take a look at, for example, the law in Indonesia, much of it is still based in how it was ruled during colonial times. Actually, just recently, Indonesia has made changes in their law that was very publicly debated about, and people were very angry about it, mostly the young people, because there were many different law changes, but one in specific made it to the headlines, and that was because the Indonesian government says, okay, but we are now going to penalize people who have intercourse outside of marriage. And people were saying things like, oh, but that's like radical Islam, and Indonesia is going to become a new Pakistan or something, and like that's a bad thing or whatever. I don't know, it became really political really fast, but people did not want to see what the reason behind it was. Actually, one of the reasons behind it is that people wanted to protect the unity of marriage and of family life, mostly, and that comes from indigenous norms and values. A lot of it actually comes from indigenous norms and values, and when you look at it from a Western perspective, it becomes criminalized very easily because it doesn't fit within their framework. So everything that happens there, when you look at it from a Western perspective, it's very easy to criminalize it. But do you actually know what went down? Do you actually know what these indigenous people stand for? Do you actually know their norms and values? And the answer is, no, you don't. And if you don't get to say in it. That's what I think. And yeah, so a lot of these things are still happening there. And I think it's a good thing that Indonesia is finally taking a step in remodeling their law structures. And what I also noticed that the Indonesian government, the current government, and of course we don't know this yet because Indonesia is having an election next year, so we don't know if this is going to continue, but they are actually starting with a really big initiative in taking a look at their own history, including what happened in 1965, which is a really big taboo subject, of course, because of what happened when Sukarno got...
Not everyone knew what Bandung was.
Right.
Like we had 5 hands, so you gotta explain what happened in 1965.
1965. So in 1965, the coup d'etat, they say it in Indonesia. The government of Sukarno was overthrown by Suharto. Very easy.
Sukarno was the one who initiated actually the Bandung
The
at the time to unite against imperialism, colonialism. Yeah.
Exactly, and Sukarno is the one who fought for Indonesian independence. Sukarno is the founding father of Indonesia, who is still criminalized here in the Netherlands because people see Sukarno as someone who stole their precious colony. So Suharto came, and Suharto was backed by US government, and communism was criminalized. And people who so much as had a neighbor or a family member who was active within the Partai Komunis Indonesia, they were not sure of their lives anymore. A lot of people actually fled here. A lot of my friends were born in Russia or other parts of the world, and they couldn't go back to Indonesia because their parents were criminalized for communist activities. And I believe more than 1 million people were eventually...
It was in the hundreds and thousands.
Yeah.
I'm gonna look at Chris. What do you know the number?
The exact number?
We definitely don't know an exact number. At least 500,000.
Yes.
But actually, Suharto's own military officers, some were bragging about 2 or 3 million. So
Yes.
1 million is a commonly accepted number now.
Yeah, 1 million people were murdered between 1965 and 1968, I believe. And so that's never been spoken about in Indonesia, like not really. And people who have communist ties or have families who had communist ties are sometimes still being criminalized without most of the people in Indonesia even knowing what communism really is. So they just see it as, okay, but communism was here and we were not allowed to have a religion anymore because communism is against religion. That's the only thing they know, basically, in the conversations, and that's why we should criminalize them. And they don't want to talk about this, but they do want to talk about how Sukarno freed us from the colonizers. But a lot of people who were communists actually helped us achieve this. And why is this not being really talked about? So the president, the current president, has finally said, okay, we regret the past. He didn't say an apology, he regrets the past. And in line of that, he is starting a really big research campaign with different ministries in Indonesia to look into this past, the 1965, but also a lot of other things that went down with all the other nations, the other islands that are in Indonesia, such as the Moluccans and West Papua, which is still being fought over.
Thank you, and maybe also final question, and then we can maybe also open it up to the audience. So what was so we went over it, you have now a new government, but I still want to zoom into this 1965 period. So there was a lot of communist, socialist killed, and sometimes you get labeled I get labeled in the Netherlands sometimes a communist, yes, without using the word class or anything, or Marx. I haven't read the book yet. Anyway, so it's becoming a swear word. But what was the legacy, because you had how long was the dictatorship on?
Of Suharto?
Yeah, Suharto.
Oh my, 1998.
1998, so you have about 30 years dictatorship,
yes,
right? And they were one of the biggest, let's say, beneficiaries as well of the IMF World Bank. So your government had a debt when they came out of the dictatorship, and that means something. Can you say something? Because then you try to return to normal government, let's say, but what is the legacy of 30 years dictatorship? What does it mean today for Indonesia? What did that legacy leave?
The legacy of Suharto, you mean?
Yes,
right?
and the difficulty that brings for bringing Indonesia forward today.
I believe it's actually one of the same strategies that were used during colonial times, which is the divide and conquer. So a lot of people with different opinions are being held against each other and prevented from becoming a unity, which is also initially a strategy that the Netherlands posed when Indonesia was being formed. We cannot be a unity. If we're a unity, then they know for sure that they would lose. And that is something that was also applied during Suharto times. And as long as you kept the people happy, the bellies filled, and they didn't know what was going on in the backseat, then it was fine. But after the dictatorship, people actually found out more in detail about his corruption. And his family still lives there and lives off this corruption that he did upon the land. So all the money that he got from the taxes, from all the people that he could steal from, they were, they're still alive. And the legacy is still there. And actually Indonesia, for not too long ago, was in the list of one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Is because of this legacy, because of this. We don't, when you say it in the Netherlands, we don't want to share it with other people, it's just ours, something like that. That's what I noticed, at least.
Thank you, and then I want to open it up. Thank you all for sharing, really, and I know we can like fill days with each context, and so I know it's also, to the surface, but yeah, that's also the idea of exchange, that we learn and maybe we see commonalities. So I want to open it to the audience and maybe give one remark before it also open to the audience. With the legacies of dictatorship or corrupt governments, ours is also corrupt, but we don't name it because, as Sandhu said, it has a white face on it, but we have many corruption problems as well. But the thing is also with 30 years of dictatorship and this government, so the government spends money that doesn't benefit the people for these 30 years, and they are now in debt. And if you're in debt with the IMF and World Bank, and that's why I think one of you also said with the debt cancellation is so important, this is a demand that is across the global south echoed, is we should cancel odious debt. Odious debt, like debt we shouldn't have had, is because they're now in debt to the government because they had a puppet dictatorship, and now they have to pay with interest rate back to these banks, and it didn't benefit the people. But if you have a debt with the bank, you're not allowed to restructure your economy, because you have to abide by the rules of the bank. That because there's we talked about strings attached. You give the loan and you say, with this loan you have to do this, this, and that economic policy. To give one concrete example with this, if I go to Indonesia, I'm very rich suddenly, right? I can live like a king. Every euro is a whole meal, and yada yada. That's also the same for corporations. If they want to buy land, it's just a euro for I don't know how much land. This is economic policies by these world banks. They say, open up your market for foreign companies, because that's gonna, the whole neoliberal project benefit the economy. So they lower the prices of everything, they inflate it. That's economic policies that's designed from here, implemented through dictatorship and debt, that you can't get out of it. If you're indebted, you cannot restructure the economy. So I just wanted to flag that out, that there's more than 42 countries currently having odious debt and cannot come out of their economic situation because of actually the colonial structure that we have today. So I just wanted to share that as well. Then I want to look to you. I mean, I have so many questions to you, that you have so much to share more, but I also want to look to you if there's a question, or it can also be a remark.
What I would like very much, first I want to invite you, we are already for 3 months demonstrating on the dam against the coup d'etat in Peru. And going back to our subject,
sorry, I was really...
oh, yeah. Going back to our subject, I personally, and this is something people will discuss or not, I'm not really interested in reparations. In Bolivia, we say the following, and Evo Morales with Partij Mas said also again and again, we don't want any reparations, we just want to be left alone and to develop our own politics, our own culture, our own economy on our own terms. And that's what we want, that's what we need. We do not need, and so at this moment what's happening, the reason why Peru got a coup d'etat is because the war in Ukraine. What happened is that Bolivia, with its new policies, was having economical deals with any country it decided to. So Bolivia has economical relations with China, with Russia, with India. United States and European Union are not happy about that. So they installed in December the past year coup d'etat in order to avoid that Bolivia can make use of the harbor for the export of lithium, for instance, which is very important for the war industry. Because through Chile, they don't get it. And under the President Castillo, they did get the freedom to export to whichever country they want. So that's, at this moment, officially there have been killed in Peru 80 civilians, and that's the official number.
And where can we support this protest that's happening, or should people come to you if they want to know more about it?
Yeah, every Sunday we're standing on the dam. And yeah,
it's easy to find.
Yeah,
every Sunday.
So if
on
you
the
feel like just, and then we can have conversations about that. Maybe think about other options. Yeah, and there is a lot of things happening that I cannot tell about it right now because there is no time for it.
Thank you for the question, but it does raise something, a dynamic, what you say, like they're punished or good, how you want to name it, for the fact that they want to have their own trade or economics or do their foreign affairs sovereign. And Kjeld, that brings me to the question on Bonaire, why is a cucumber €4 there?
I have to laugh. I didn't expect that question out of the blue like that. So
you told me once, I was like,
yeah,
why?
It's so interesting. So The Hague also has control of our trade. We don't do that. We don't have a say in it. For example, I'm not going to use a cucumber because that one is maybe a bit more straightforward. I'm going to use, for example, bananas. Bananas go from, like, for example, Brazil to the Netherlands to then be shipped back to Bonaire. Why?
You see,
it makes no
maybe
sense. It's first of all not sustainable. It's really bad for the environment because you're using so much like fossil fuels to do that. The price goes up insanely. If we could have traded directly with Brazil, it would have been different. Would have been different.
But Netherlands wants to be the middleman. Yes.
So, is Bonaire a part of the CARICOM?
No. Oh wait. Oh, I want to go into that as well. Thanks for asking that question. CARICOM, an amazing institution. It's for those who don't know, it's kind of like the European Union of the Caribbean and South America. Kind of, so you have a lot of just the head of state of Jamaica, the head of state of Barbados, who now has a new one, etc. Great Caribbean heads of state, and then in the middle of them you'll find like some Dutch minister who's there to represent Bonaire, Sint Eustatius, and Ceylon. No, we don't get a say in CARICOM. We don't get to represent ourselves in pretty much anything internationally. It'll be a Dutch minister.
Mic drop. All right. Is there any other question from the audience to the panel? And otherwise, I have another final question. We have room for, let's say, 2 more questions. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to add a little bit more context, I think, to the Caribbean context, I guess. Because we talk a lot about, and I think it's been mentioned a lot, yeah, okay. The divide and conquer prospect is, we see it overall. I was just having a conversation at the table about how when you see Dutch Caribbean perspective of our history of colonialism is in some ways very similar to the Indonesian, and but we don't ever connect on that. There's no connection between the societies because it's literally divide and conquer. It was only when I moved here to the Netherlands that I was able to understand what was happening on that side of the world, but by Dutch colonization.
I agree with that.
So like we have no knowledge of that on the islands themselves. And I believe divide and conquer also goes even further than what we see happening right now in the Caribbean. It is, for me, if I were to fly from Aruba to Curacao or Bonaire, I'm easily paying about $800. I can't even visit.
And it's a 20-minute flight.
Yeah, it's a 20-minute flight, and I can't visit my family. So that divide and conquer, we see it so clearly. They don't want, for example, Caribbeans to become a sovereign thing within its own, which we have the capacity to be, but they can't allow it because that means they lose power within the Caribbean entity. And so that divide and conquer aspect, I believe, is something to be focused on within all of our communities because that's how they remain in power, I would say. So, yeah.
I want to kind of go into that divide and conquer thing as well because some people would then say, oh, you know, like every island's for themselves. You have Aruba and Curacao who did their own thing, and then the other islands which followed. And I recently had an analysis of that which I found very interesting. You maybe know why Aruba left the federation, because all the money went to Curacao, who then had to redivide it to everybody else, which of itself is also divide and conquer, not to like point fingers at Curacao. But if the Dutch state indeed were to do it they just, for example, looked at, okay, every island brings in this much money, divide the pool of money we give each island for themselves, and then they do it. But they purposely gave it to Curacao, also with the whole Curacao and onderhoorigheden thing that the islands initially weren't even named. And then that caused a bunch of tension with the other islands which had their own economical capacity. And that caused the whole friction of the islands like saying, oh, maybe this construction that we're on isn't good, we should step out and negotiate things straightly with the Netherlands ourselves. Because the way that they set it up, there's going to be one of the islands as the middleman, which also isn't a very useful way of doing that. And hence the whole dissolution of the federation, right? Also to connect back to the Indonesia thing, I want to connect back because so the constitution that they had in mind for Indonesia during when they wanted to forcefully put that on Indonesia, when that didn't work, they took that same constitution, modified it a bit, and applied it to the Caribbean islands.
Oh, that's that's why we're in a panel to conversate, because the model has been applied on both sides of the sea. But I think this is a really important question, and I don't know if either of you also want to reflect on that with the divide and rule. maybe how it played out in the context, but also maybe what can be done against it, maybe in the Bolivian context, what brought the unity between the 36 nations to make a collective flag, because something they apparently, maybe to start with you, they apparently, were able to unite under it, but what were conditions to make sure you were not divided? What would help in overcoming this divide and rule tactics, you would say?
Yes, okay, thank you. Yeah, I believe the common goal of all these 36 nations were to recognize themselves, to understand that they have their own power to live, to be there, to use their land, to recognize their own children as their own children, So there was a beautiful moment where all the nations were marching into the creation of the new constitution. And yeah, it was a beautiful, beautiful moment to see all of the nations walking days and days just to show the appreciation for this action. It was completely inspiring. Then I believe that everybody understand how divide and conquer was so powerful, because it happened after 500 years.
It took too long to get there, basically.
Yes, but mainly I believe that it's not because of an oppressive hand, but mainly because the people wanted to see it. That is the thing. That is the thing. If you want to open your clarity, your vision, and on the people around you, then you can see it, then you can release it. The way is not to find another enemy to oppress, It's not about oppression. So yeah, these 36 countries made it, and they made it together to be recognized as a plurinational state, which was where we are now. And yeah, that was fantastic. But there's always a tricky thing there. We are still under the idea of colonial thinking, which is the politics. The politics and the way that we are trying to understand that one system can rule everything. That is a big mistake, because yeah, if we also are, all of us, if we are trying to fight against this system, what we are trying to do is another system that has the same shape. So the idea, I believe, to do something about it is to not use hierarchy anymore. Instead, we can use something that is called heterarchy, that is not made of pointing this the pyramid on, but mainly being small little cells that interact each other.
Like a relational web.
Exactly. Yeah. Why? And this is because also a good thing about divide and conquer. Because imagine if we are all together and we give all together all of our power to one people, then we lose everything. That's what we are doing all the time. But if we are all together, but we keep our power, and then we are just share what we want to share between among us, and then we empower ourselves. So we don't need to have a flag for every citizen in the world, but mostly we need to be in contact with the ones that we care and we love. So your information can go through me, and I can put my filters on, do whatever I feel is better for all of us, and then change it to you, give it to you, and then you can do the same, and spread it. There is a spread of information and value. So I believe that is another good example of divide and conquer that we can use also.
And I think you actually you pointed also actually a very important divide and rule mechanism is to privilege one group or give them more the position to decide over a bigger region. And then that causes tension, I think, also with the Curaçao. So I think that's an important mechanism. Redistribute and let people have their own say. More let's say, less centralized. Fitria, you want to respond or add to it?
I would like to add that education is very important. because back in colonial times, what you said and what you also mentioned, you know, giving privilege to one group over the other, privilege meant education. So many Indonesians or indigenous peoples that are now part of Indonesia, they were deprived of education. They could not read or write. They were not supposed to know what really was going on, because the more you know, the more they would, you know, be against the colonial structures. So I think in order to have this division where we stand united and have a distribution that is more equal to one another, you need to make education accessible. That's just priority. That should be priority.
And I think also the content of the education, because what you said, like not knowing your own history, because what was for me eye-opening at the time when I was in student protest in Amsterdam about decolonizing the university. Then there was also the same protest happening in South Africa about decolonizing the university. I was like, wait a minute, you're learning the
Yes.
same philosophers? What the heck, right?
So also, yeah, a lot of things have already been in place. Also from activists before us, for example, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can also tap from inspiration and wisdom that they have already fought for. And I think we should give them more credit for it, definitely, and not, you know, claim it as our own.
Definitely, that's beautiful.
Add onto the education part, specifically, we need to create our own knowledge. We need to have our own systems of knowledge. I think that's more important, because I feel if we're, to take your example to maybe an extreme, like if I were to be educated in becoming an expert in neoliberalism and neoliberal ways, it still doesn't help the movement or anything. So we really need to have our own basis of knowledge, and then that I need to get educated to us all.
Thank you, and maybe too, because I know we
Can
are.
I say something?
You're gonna just one practical, and then you're gonna say something. Just for the time, I have to also keep track of time. We're gonna move into a break soon, so I also want to ask maybe to everyone give a final reflection on maybe ways to go forward, but also how people can support what you're doing. So how can we also be of support for you? But first, share your thought that you want to add.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess it's very important to understand that one of the problems that we are having as a civilization is that we are still keeping in the same shape of understanding, that is the induction of information. And this is ruled in every institution of education. What does it mean? Is that we feel this need, or we need this clarity to be a learner, to learn something. And we go with this fragility open into an institution that is going to feed us with what they want. So what we need to do actually is to break this idea of induction of information, induction of education, induction of communication. It is one of the things that are really make us a lot of problems for us and for the next generations. According to education, this is very important. What we need to do and to understand also, put it like in a balance. What happens 10,000 years ago until maybe 300 years, and what is happening in these last 300 years about knowledge, about understanding, about what to think that is technology, what is about social understanding and social advances. So we need to understand a little bit. Why I'm saying this? Because what we have in the past is our ancient knowledge, ancient wisdom, was something that gave us the chance to be in balance for thousands of years. That's what we need to, in one way, put it back together. Like here, this is great. I mean, there's not only knowledge, but it's our love. It's love not only for yourself, but you as a family, as a member of us. And that is the most important thing. What is education? Education, I believe, is like understanding us where we really are. Not thinking in the future, not just having this mindset of what is going to be or what is going to happen in this other part of the world, how many millions are lost somewhere in somehow kind of war.
but mostly here. We are here right now. So that is the most important thing. Education starts for us understanding where we are. And the most important to not accept induction of communication and thinking. That is a really, really important practice that we can share.
Thank you, and also thank you for bringing in the concept of time, right? Because we also have often short terms thinking. We can even feel disempowered, like we cannot change anything. But if you look in other ways of life and thinking, you have a way longer time frame or 7 generations thinking, and every empire is fallen, right? So if it's not about us here as an individual, but next generation, you know that this empire will crumble by itself as well. Maybe we're not going to see it, but it's hopeful to be part of that. Slower, longer they went before us, they're going to continue after us, and we know what we are part of. So I think, yeah, thank you for bringing in time. Fitria, do you have any closing?
Yes. So one of the questions was also how you could support us, right?
Yeah, for your context in relation, what are maybe reparations demand that are logical from your position with being active in Indonesia?
So from the Indonesian perspective, one of the most important thing is the claim that the Netherlands has that Indonesia was only freed or independent on the 27th of December 1929. But, no, 1949.
1949, yeah.
And our Independence Day is 17th of August 1945, and it's still not legally recognized by the Netherlands. So that means Indonesia cannot make any claims of what went down between 1945 and 1949, because the Netherlands has done a lot of damage, of course, in the course of colonial history, but specifically in that period. And what is happening here as well is that the Indonesian history or their colonial history in Indonesia is being fragmented. So other groups that were actually also part of the colony of the oppression, like doing the oppressing upon other people, are getting more space to claim their victimhood, while the indigenous people of Indonesia that are now Indonesians, they don't get space at all. So learn your history, I would say, and support the companies that are really making the impact on claiming reparations in the first place. And in the context of Indonesia, that's Comité Nederlandse Ereschulden, that's
KUKB.
KUKB, exactly, Comité Hutang Kehormatan Belanda, Dutch Honor Debts, and Jeffrey Pondaag is the founder of this organization, and he actually demanded, he sued the Dutch government in 2011, and he won. And so that sent a message to all of us Indonesians here in the Netherlands that it's possible to claim that. It gave so much hope and faith that we can actually make a difference. So learn from these organizations and don't lose your faith.
Thank you for bringing that in. And we have also, with what you mentioned, Jeffrey Pondaag, we have monthly decolonial learning sessions. We have one in-depth interview with him and Marjolein van Pagé about these court cases and what it showed and the coloniality in our decolonial learning sessions. And one thing that was really eye-opening for me as well with what Jeffrey shared as well, because yes, it was a victory that they won the court case, but the court case was still very colonial because they had to do it within the colonial framework to get their right. And for instance, one of the amounts they calculated for the victims, like you said, the minimum wage in Bonaire is, a black life in Bonaire has a different value minimum wage than in the Netherlands, and the same was in colonial Indonesia. So they calculated the loss of life at 120 euros or something, like it was ridiculous. Like
it was a man who was actually beheaded, and as I'm writing my book about Indonesian perspectives on colonial history, this man that was beheaded was actually, and I found out, was a cousin of my grandfather. And he got 123 euros for the fact that his father was beheaded and his head was shown into the whole village and people had to kiss it because he was a leader and the Dutch military knew how to cancel them out. And he got 123 euros for it, which he of course denied because it's nothing. And that is why these court cases are colonial, because the Netherlands does not legally recognize 17th of August 1945. If that happens, then we can really start talking on an equal basis as Indonesians and demand reparations.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm still processing that.
Sorry.
Oh no, I mean, you don't have to be sorry, that's just messed up. Maybe this is the philosopher in me, but if I really have to answer the question of how can people help, I think with Bonaire, we're in a unique situation that the ability for decision making lies here. So how we vote here also determines how things happen there. So I would urge people to be mindful of that and really, for the parties that you vote for, see what their policies are for the other part of the Netherlands that often gets ignored. See if they actually look, in bettering the conditions for the islands there. I think that's one very concrete way that people can help. Yeah. Also, this is maybe a petty one. Like, don't go to vacation on Bonaire.
Yes.
Just don't. Leave us alone. Because again, that whole vacation thing also ends up strengthening the inequalities and everything. So it's actually like you end up making things worse for people on the island as well. So that's why I'm not the biggest fan of the whole how the situation of tourism is there. So.
It's a settlement, so yeah, they operate as settlements. So thank you for sharing that as well. I think this gives a lot of food for thought. I think you've opened up so many layers to what colonialism, from divide and rule to economics to legal to ancestral culture. Like there's so many dimensions to reparations. So I just also wanted to point out there's probably layers that we have not discussed that maybe you do bring in. So you don't have to, if later on in the breakout circles you bring in something, an expertise or knowledge or a layer that we haven't covered, please do so, because it's about opening all these layers of reparations, and I'm sure there's a lot that hasn't been covered yet as well. But before we go into smaller groups, the smaller groups are sort of already made. I mean, you can switch tables, it's also nice. But after this short break of, let's say, 10 minutes, you can have a coffee or go to the bathroom. Then Pravini will explain what we're going to do next. So see you in 10 minutes. Thank you. And give a warm applause to the panel.